What I want to tell you today is what I myself witnessed during this forced march, the greatest and most terrible evacuation of a city our times have ever witnessed. Imagine 150,000 men, women, and children fleeing, looking for a refuge, for a shelter towards a city that is 200 kilometers away. There's only one path, one road, no other escape routes. And this path, blocked between the high summits of Sierra Nevada and the sea, goes up and goes down. With slopes of over 30 kilometers. And the city they're looking for is Almería, by Norman Bethune. So I fell asleep, and when I woke up, the lorry was driving downhill. It was like the last mile, but what mile? From the mountain range towards the city, tens of thousands of refugees run. There were crowds of people covering the hills, the roads, the beaches. Some were walking in the water, trying to reach the city as soon as possible. At the point where the road entered into the city, the lorry could only advance centimeter by centimeter. We felt like we had been blocked for hours, and the line of refugees was advancing in front of us. We were driving behind the refugees, and we finally reached Almería by Norman Bethune in the Wound. But the Desbandá, this flight, didn't stop there. To tell us about that, today we have Dr. Eusebio Rodríguez, who is going to talk to us about one of the events that is not well known, and that's the children that reached Murcia. We also have Juan Francisco Colomina, a researcher who has studied from Malaga to the Pyrenees the long exile of the citizens of Malaga. And Franco continued the persecution beyond the Pyrenees. And Dr. Jordi Guixé will tell us about this, the persecuted exiled people, and he's going to be connecting through the internet, an online conference. We are going to be told about how life was away from our borders for those people who went to the exile all the way to Mexico. Dr. Pilar Domínguez, who is going to tell us María Gallegos' life, refugee from Malaga in Mexico. And finally, we have María Amparo Sánchez testimony with the memory of the Desbandá towards France and the concentration camp, and in 1956 the going back to Spain. So we will give the floor to the first of the speakers today, Eusebio Rodríguez, who's a PhD in contemporary history. He works in the Department of History of the Provincial Council of Almería. He's a researcher and studies the Republic, the Civil War, the Franco's repression in Almería and Granada. Over 40 publications. Among them, the Franco's repression in Almería from 39 till 45, and also for other periods of time. And he has also published other articles like La Desbandá of Malaga in the province of Almería that you can buy here, and also Almería under the bombs with Fran Martin. He's got an award, history award, given to him by the regional government of Andalusia. And I think it's time to give him the floor.
Bueno, vamos a ver si me apaño. Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por su asistencia. Gracias a la organización por haber contado conmigo.
I really want to thank the organization for having me here today. Thank you, Pepe, as well for your introduction. And given that we have very short time, I'm going to go straight to the point. I had prepared a lecture that has been reduced to 20 minutes at the most, so I'm going to be very brief. At the beginning, I was asked to tell the story of this transition of the research on this topic that has already been made by Encarnación. Encarnación has been one of the leaders one of the pioneers in the serious research on the topic of La Desbandá. So later on, Maribel Brenes and Andrés Fernández published the excerpt of Almería, and they started working on this topic again, but Encarnación and also Andrés and Maribel were the ones who told this transit throughout the province of Malaga and through the province of Almería. And from that reality we said ourselves, Colomina and I, we said, what's happening in Almería with the people who get to Almería? Because the story of La Desbandá finished there. So we knew there had been bombings, not in the city center, but in the outskirts. So the area of La Rambla was a part of the city where there was a wall of contention. And the people who arrived to Almería, they made fires in this area, in this kind of boulevard or promenade called La Rambla. And many people died there, according to the testimonies we have. But there are no records. We don't have records at the hospital. In the journal of burials of the city hall, there are no recordings because these people had no identification. These were anonymous people.
Hablábamos de qué pasa en Almería, sucintamente en contraposición con lo que vamos a encontrar en Murcia.
So, as opposed to the situation in Murcia, which is the next step of our research, now we have left Almería and we have started to research what is happening beyond Almería. We have finished with the research about Almería. We're starting with Murcia, and we're going to start soon with Albacete. We want to know what happened with all these people who were displaced to Albacete and Alicante. So we have observed two approaches to this topic of the refugees. So Morón, which is a commander-in-chief, sees the refugees as a problem and he doesn't want them. So there is a confrontation with Maroto that starts for this reason. I'm going to tell you very briefly. Maroto asked to the trade unions who got to Almería, they asked for fuel because they wanted to go and help the people of La Desbandá. There were a lot of vehicles because on the 6th of February, there were already people from Malaga who had arrived by car, by vehicle, to Almería, and they were registered in the hotels. So the rich people got to Almería by car, but the poor people were the one facing the worst problems. So there were also non-rich people that could get to Almería also by car. And we have discovered that on the 7th there was a theater piece planned in the theater of Almería, and they were going to make this theater play for the refugees. So we can establish many different kinds of refugees, those that arrive very fast in a couple of hours, and those that need 3, 4, 6 days to get to the city because they go by foot. We know that the Republic made all the efforts to help these refugees. But besides the Republic, we have the local authorities. And for Gabriel Maroto, this was a problem because the presidents of the trade unions, they ask for fuel because they have the vehicles, but they don't have the fuel. But Maroto refuses to give them the fuel. And he sent all this fuel, 2,500 kilos of fuel, to Lorca because he wanted to protect this fuel, and he said he was convinced that this fuel couldn't be used to help the people on the road. It has to be used to fight in the warfare instead of helping the people on the road. So Morón, he didn't care about the refugees, but they supposed a problem for him because the city was full of people and there were not enough place to host the people. When I say us, I'm meaning Juan Fran and me. So we have worked a lot with international press because the local press was really contaminated. So we chose the Netherlands, and we found a correspondent called Nevendorn, and he gives a figure. He was a reporter for a newspaper from the Netherlands, I don't remember the name, and he says that 150,000 people have arrived to Malaga in the last days. This is a press release from the 14th. So on the whole, there are more than 200,000 people in Almería. The problem is a housing problem because all the buildings are used and the Red Aid uses all the facilities of Almería for the refugees. So they took the children first and they couldn't host the adults, so they were left outside in the streets.
And that way, well, we have the feeling that the people who were the most powerful then and now, who are still the most powerful families, hosted refugees and had them in their homes. And at the end of the war, they said that they did it because they were afraid, that they were thinking that they could suffer from the retaliation of the mayor of Almería. In any case, whatever the reason, they were hosted in Almería, but officially only 11,000 people were taken in charge. That's what has been registered in the refugee books, in the civil governments. That's what we have in the archives in Almería. There were lists of people, 11,000 in Almería. In Huelva de Almería, well, Those are the ones that have been included in the book, and also in Villarrubio. Well, we don't really know how many, but there is a list, official list of refugees. But the other municipalities have no register. And why were these lists prepared? Because 50 pesetas per day were given to them so that they would be fed. But they said that they needed more money, that it was not enough. And in some areas, all the refugees were expelled very fast. So the hosting, the lodgings was a problem, and also the health problem was also important. There were some stables and other areas that were modified to accommodate them, and well, there was a typhus emergence, and well, the security excuse was just exactly an excuse to take the refugees away from Almeria by train, by ship, etc. They were saying that this was a security issue, security risk, because some of them were arriving with carrying weapons in the rear guard. But there were not many weapons there, because there were only elderly people, women and children, because the young people, young men between 20 and 30 were fighting in the battlefield. They had been mobilized. And new units were created, and that were sent to the front line. Well, food. Almeria is a province that wasn't suffering a lot from hunger during the war. The fisheries could cover, well, half of the fish was used in Almeria, and the other half was sent to Granada, and in the port there were supplies of flour. And people, well, the other day someone asked me if the typical dish migas is a tradition linked to the fact that the port received a lot of flour, because this is a dish based on flour. In any case, there was sufficient food in Almeria, and 2 million pesetas were donated by the ministers to try and feed the refugees as long as possible. But well, we understood that the puzzle was not complete. We checked the documents in the hospitals, saw that there were no people wounded by shrapnel. There were no girls, no pregnant women, so that made us think there was information lacking there. So we saw in the census complete families, but we didn't find any lists of isolated children. And none of the new refugees gave birth to anyone during these days. That was also troubling for us. But then we started researching Murcia. Murcia was a big city in comparison to Almeria. Almeria was a small town, quite insufficient, and with deficient facilities. It had only one hospital, and that was not enough to cover all the needs. The director of the hospital was the head of the information service working for Franco in Almeria. Later on, he was a great cardiologist, but Nevertheless, he was the head of the intelligence service working for Franco. So, as I was saying, in Almería there was only a small hospital, but in Murcia there were 5 big hospitals. The Blood Hospital, Casa Roja, in the University of Murcia, the Hospital of the International Brigade La Pasionaria, the Hospital of San Fermín Galán, and the Provincial Hospital, which was really big. And I think that it still exists today. Besides this, Murcia had something else that was lacking in Almería. Do you know what the doctors in Almería do when the refugees of La Desbandá arrived? Well, they all escaped the city. Well, not all of them, but most of them. So the civil governor sent the police to find them and threatened them to take them to prison if they didn't go back to the Almería. But in Murcia, the doctors were there, they stayed there, and there was the most important surgery hospital in Europe at the time. The doctors there came from the international brigades, they were volunteers, and they were the best from several countries. Among the routes of transportation of the refugees, one of them was by train to Águilas. And from there, they were taken to Murcia, or one of the villages in the province of Murcia. And a hospital was created there. And in the province of Murcia, there are several other hospitals. In Alhama de Murcia, in Caravaca, the Clinical Hospital of Cartagena. That was the army. Mazarrón's hospital. In Cartagena, it was the Navy's hospital. So they had many more hospitals and additional ones were built. And that was very quick. All this was very quick, very fast, because no one was expecting such a crowd to arrive, but they managed to do so very quickly. I don't know if I already mentioned this, but the truth is that wounded people from Granada, from Malaga, from Almería, they were not taken to the hospital to Almería, but to Murcia's hospitals. That was done so for many years, by train or by ambulance. So the most seriously wounded were taken to Murcia's hospitals. In Murcia, there are 2 key figures that changed the way people were thinking about the refugees, their mindset, let's say. In Almería, this was an obstacle, a disturbance. The mayor and Mateo Carreras, they had a mindset that had an impact in Fernando Piñuela. At the end of the war, he was executed. And he said that the refugees were people who had been unrooted from their home, from their family, from their friends. So families should not be separated. Families had to stay together because they had been unrooted from their homes, their families, their friends. So children could not be separated. You couldn't take the children to certain centers and keep the parents somewhere else. No, the families had to stay together, and they created several shelters. The idea was to keep the family together. And there are some villages where this was difficult, But in some villages there were up to 25 houses where a family could be placed per house, and there would be a teacher for every 25 children. Well, I need to run now. And then they created centers, something that was not done in Almería. They were called, well, there was thermal and bath centers. And they were called the centers where the needs were going to be taken away. That was the popular name they gave to it. There were kindergartens. These were children from Madrid that had arrived with no family. And then there were children's colonies. So for the children who were alone, in some places there were up to 2,000 children without their parents. But the philosophy, the way they worked, well, they had a specific timetable. They got up at 7 a.m. and they wanted to teach them values. Authoritarianism was not used. They wanted the children to obey because they would be convinced that this was important. It was such a pity at the end of the war when these children were under the authority of the courts for minors. I have a note here. The children had to learn to be generous, about justice, to love work, love the truth, the animals, the plants, and other human beings. I'm sorry, my time is over.
Eusebio, muchas gracias.
So, thank you so much. I'm sorry, but I'm executing orders here. Well, as we already explained originally, well, of course, they wouldn't have time to present the articles as a whole, but all those articles will be published later on in detail. So we're sorry, but our time is limited. Thank you. Now we have Juan Francisco Colomina. He studied humanities in the University of Almería. He's got a PhD in communication and contemporary history. He published a book on La Desbandá in the province of Almería together with Eusebio. And, well, he always asks us to say that he is above all a researcher. I say that he's a small mouse who goes into the libraries and archives, and he's been working in Franco repression camps. He's studied Masons, and he has also studied Franco repression in Andalusia in its social consequences and the Republicans in foreign camps. And, well, Jordi Guixé is not here, but he read a book about the repression of Republicans. That's the book by Guixé. And he started researching on the other side of the Pyrenees and discovered the concentration camps and so on. So Juanfran is going to talk about from Malaga to the Pyrenees in the exile of citizens from Malaga. Yes, you don't have much time. Good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank the Association of La Desbandá and the organizers of the Congress for having invited me, and above all for having organized this kind of Congress of these dimensions. I know very well that this is very difficult. Okay, well, this is not the right PPT. I'm sorry. I've got so many PPTs on La Desbandá. This is not the one I wanted to bring. But, well, more or less, I can use it.
Yo quiero hablar aquí hoy, muy rápido, de la situación que vive.
Very quickly, I will refer to the situation of exiled people, particularly for those from the city of Malaga. I always refer to the war as the Spanish War, the Spain's war instead of the Civil War. And as my colleague Eusebio said, we know quite a lot about why the city fell in the hands of Franco, and well, we know more or less what happened. Of course, the figures they're not clear. There's a whole discussion on the figures, but well, they went all the way to Almería, but after that we had the impression they disappeared. But Eusebio has continued the research all the way up to Murcia, and I know that they already studying the situation in Valencia and then in Catalonia. So why did I start investigating, researching the refugees from Malaga? Well, I studied initially all Andalusian citizens in exile. There's an estimation that says that about, well, in the year 1939, there were about 40,000 or 50,000 Andalusian people in exile. That was what was considered at the time. But now we've got 20,000 people in a database, names, itineraries, all the details. But we considered that it was quite surprising to find out that out of those 20,000 people, about 8,000 were from Malaga, and about half of them were civilians. I always start with this sentence by Manuel Chávez Nogales, who was a journalist who wrote this sentence in 1937 in a book. The exiled person is someone without a homeland, without a motherland, someone who is a guest no one wishes to have and who needs to be forgiven and must be humble and show in their existence. So here we have a map where you can see the audio of the people of Malaga who fled from the city and then followed all the way along the coast, the eastern coast. And here you can see the figures to have so that you can understand more or less the number of people from Malaga. If you look at this map again, so going from Malaga to Almería, the logical exit would be Morocco, Algeria, not France, of course. So we found it quite interesting or surprising to find so many people from Malaga in France. Well, there were some publications by Encarnación, Lucía, and other researchers, and then we found out that some clues. We saw that many of the refugees coming from Malaga went all the way to Catalonia, to Barcelona, to the industrial area of Barcelona, but we didn't really have an explanation to know of the origin. But in fact, they had left Malaga in 1937, but with time, well, they started settling down in Catalonia, and then in 1939, end of January and the beginning of February of that year, there was a second Desbandá, a second flight. When they left from Malaga, they had to leave everything behind because of the bombs. And in the year 1939, there was another flight, another Desbandá, where 500,000 people were fleeing towards the French borders. They had to leave everything behind.
El latillo
They just could take a few things and maybe a very small case if they had one, and they were trying to escape. Well, those who were driving lorries or cars or whatever, they had to left also the vehicles behind because there was such a long queue. It was impossible to keep fleeing by vehicle. And there was a very diverse mix of people with agricultures, politicians, deputies, and it was a very difficult escape for them. And also, just as in the road from Malaga to Almería with the bombings in the French border, they were also bombed by the Francoist aviation all throughout the Pyrenees. You can see some of the border points. There were, for instance, so there was this crowd of people. It was quite an organized crowd because France stopped the people at the border and they talked to the Republican government that was almost completely defeated, and then they contacted the government of Franco in order to organize all these refugees and in order to prevent them from crossing into France, from crossing the border. So they knew it was very difficult to control all the crowd because the Francoist regime was going to try to kill the most of the refugees. And so the pressure from the left parties in France and the pressure from groups such as the Red Cross or the Canadian authorities, they forced the French government to allow the passing of some groups. First of all, injured people, then women and children, and then around the first days of February, they authorized the crossing of the border to military men, or more or less to everyone over 16 years old. So if you can imagine how frightening this was, they were trying to cross the border, and at the rearward there was already the army coming. Some of these criminals still have streets with the name, and we have to eliminate these streets. So I'm going to pass very fast through these. Some examples on the press. This is the French press extracts. The press were absolutely against the refugees. They were treating them off rats, communists in the bad sense. They were portraying them as dangerous persons. And there were many newspapers that were in the hands of French mafias or right-wing groups. So the press portrays a scene of invasion. So you have to know that at the time, England and France are trying not to bother to match Hitler. Germany and the Soviet Union are about to sign a non-aggression agreement. So who are the ones arriving as refugees? Well, there are the socialists, the anarchists, the communists. So all of them are dangerous individuals. So among this population, there are around 80,000 or 8 or 9,000. So they were not really welcomed, as to say. So these are some examples. We didn't make this up, of course. These are extracts from the press of the time. And these are images taken by French journalists. These are news pieces drafted by the ministries. For instance, here they say 400 children are lost in the mountains, dozens of dead persons in the Pyrenees, bodies that haven't been recovered yet. So I have to go very fast. So I will just give you some keys about the arrival in France and how are they received there. Because I'm sure our colleagues will also talk about the same situation in Mexico. So in the case of France, the very first thing they do is to classify the population and divide it into women, children, men, adults, or young people over 16. And then they are sent to hosting centers, and they are distributed all around in different camps that you can see on the screen. Some of these camps were really, well, had really terrible conditions, tragic conditions. So how were these concentration camps that the French government put in place to gather all the refugees? Well, maybe I am exaggerating. You're going to think that I am exaggerating, but the first concentration camps were basically stables. They treated people as if they were livestock. They were just leading them as you lead the sheep. So this is the treatment the Spanish refugees received when they just arrived to France. So first of all, families were separated, were divided, and then the men over 16 were sent to the concentration camps. So here you have some images, really dramatic images. A family that is separated and they have to meet like this through the fence. And then you have this little girl trying to cook something. So this is all contents from the press in France. So imagine a beach where there is only sand, and in just a couple of days the French government installs all these kilometers of fences, and then the people is just put in there with no shelter, with no buildings, with nothing. Only the fences. So at the very beginning, they tried to make these shelters, or they just use the coats in order to cover themselves and to protect a little bit themselves. And then later on, there is a kind of organization that starts to emerge inside the concentration camps, and these camps become in some way cities, because sometimes the camps had thousands of people living inside, much more than the population of the village around the camp. So this was the strategy of the French administration to organize and to manage all this population that arrived. So these are concentration camps, literally, because they concentrated people. There was no medical assistance, no healthcare, of course, almost no food. I'm not going to talk about psychiatric assistance. Of course, we have problems now at present, so imagine back then. So these people die from desperation, from injuries that they have since they were in the front line. And we have some records about the deaths, and they talked about death of the mind. So probably because of desperation. And I have an interesting question for you. Where are all those people who disappeared in the concentration camps? We don't know. In some cases, there were burials of the people who died in the concentration camps in the municipalities around, but it's not always like that. Some testimonies say that the people was buried just besides the concentration camp in the beach. These are the documents that I have been working with, that I have been analyzing. Sometimes we have the complete name, the full name, and sometimes we have the origin of the person or the religion of the person. Sometimes there are indications about features or particular characteristics of the person. This was all managed by the Ministry of Internal Affairs at the time. And there is also records about where these people go after the concentration camp, if they have unemployment or whatever they do is recorded, because we consider these people very dangerous. That's why. So 3 minutes. Okay. This is the way the refugee population live in France. Some of the documents of the different concentration camps that have been kept in the French archives, which are a little bit more flexible than the Spanish ones. And so we can learn what happened to some of these people. And some of the people here are children of La Desbandá, who left Malaga and who crossed the border when they were around 15, 17 years old, and they get to the concentration camps. We know that because of the stories of the mothers that try to find their children. So these mothers, they send letters to the Red Cross, for instance, and they say, well, I know my child, he is in that concentration camp. We left Malaga. We ran away from Malaga. And that, with that kind of document, we've been able to imagine or to recover all the journey of these people. I only have a minute, I know. What about the future, or what happened to these people next? Some of them go to the army, and they're going to be the first victims of the Nazi army. Some of them are going to go to the concentration camps of the Nazi concentration camps. Some of them go into the exile in Morocco. And some of them are going to the Soviet Union. I'm not going to say anything about Mexico because we have somebody here who's going to tell us about it. Many of these children go to Mexico. Well, and I always like to end up with this picture because despite all the time that has passed since the tragedy of La Desbandá here in Malaga, 85 years after that, we still see the same pictures, same situations, same tragedy. And I hope this Congress and all the work that is going to be done in the scientific and research field, I hope it's going to help not to repeat the history. And I hope we don't have to see this again. This is a picture of a Syrian mom and her children that are trying to escape from Syria and that ended up in a concentration camp as well. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Juanfran. Tu tiempo ha terminado.
Thank you very much, Juanfran. Your time is over. I'm sure when we have the opportunity to read your articles, your papers, we're going to learn much more. So now it's the time of Dr. Pilar Domínguez Prats, who holds a PhD from the Complutense University of Madrid. She's a professor of history at the University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. She's done that until 2019. She's a professor of the Historical Sciences Department, and she's made researches on the field of oral history of women during the Spanish Civil War and exile, also at the University Complutense of Madrid. And she has also participated in feminist studies at the UCM. Since 2004, she's president of the board. And she keeps leading many individual and collective works on the exile in Mexico for the period between 1939 and 1950. She has led a study on the Republican women in Mexico. And she had a research line on social movement, on gender relationships, history of the trade unionism in Spain, and today, following this line of memory and oral tradition, she is going to share with us the story of María Fernández. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. That's what I was saying to my colleague. As Pepe said, I deal with the topic of exilium in Mexico. Well, I've done it from the point of view of oral history that focuses on memory as the center of analysis, something which is essential to study women because they have always been the hidden voice, the hidden subject in history. So I started carrying out some interviews for my thesis at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And I had to carry out some of those interviews there in Mexico thanks to a research grant. I could be there for 2 years. And thanks to these interviews, I was able not only to make my thesis, but also to go back to those interviews and be able to recover the voices of women like María Fernández. That's his surname when she was single. She was called María Gallegos after she was married. But this is her original name. She was born in 1910. And of course, if I wanted to interview her, it would have been impossible now. So thanks to these interviews, I was able to go back to these and deal with the topic of La Desbandá. When I was doing those interviews, I hadn't heard about La Desbandá. And this is interesting not only for her, because of her, but also her husband, because her husband was a part of the interview, maybe in a paternalist way, but he gave some data because he had been in La Desbandá. They were both from Malaga, and really María didn't take part in La Desbandá, but suffered from its consequences because he was in jail. Her husband escaped from Malaga, and he was in prison. And this is what gave a value to her words in the interview, and he devoted many more minutes to talking about her imprisonment as gender repression than her life in the exile. So that's why I think this is interesting. This exile, well, my colleagues have talked about it. about what it means to live through France, and how more than 500,000 people crossed a frontier after the defeat of the Republic, and because they were fearing a law that was established in 1939, which is the law of political responsibilities that make it all retroactive up to the year 1934. So it's not only what you had done during the war, but what you had done during the period of the Republic. So these months with a series of trips that were done in France, suffering from the concentration camps, as our colleague mentioned. Also, Maria's husband had to endure that. They were able to leave for Mexico. We have to say as well that in France, the refugees that came out, according to a French researcher, 43% of them were women and children. So a great characteristic of exile was that it's a family exile. First of all in France and then later on in Mexico. So that is quite a notable difference from other exiles from before. And from the point of view of women, it's the most numerous one in the history, in the contemporaneous history of Spain. These trips to Mexico are organized they are part of the, as I called before, Vapor in Ipanema, Paco Gallegos, Maria's husband. On the 7th of July of the year 39, they depart towards Mexico from the Atlantic coast of France. It is clear that these trips were organized thanks to the cooperation of the government of the Republic and the Mexican government that offered economic help and aid, economic help, and they welcomed all these people. They reached the Veracruz port with three main ships, Sinaya, Ipanema, which is the second one, and the third one, which was the Mexic. And talking a little bit about Francisco Gallego, one of the protagonists of our story, he was born in 1906 and Lajare declared that was one of the organizations, together with SERE, that organized the trips, was going to help in this situation that was created by the Republicans himself. He declared that he had got there in July 39 on the boat Ipanema. So he told Lajare, this is documents that are part of the Foreign Affairs Archive in Madrid. He said that before the war he was working as a commerce worker, and he was part of the Republican left and the UGT political party. He was part of the local committee that proclaimed the Republic in Malaga as the member of this Republican left. And in February 1937, he didn't tell me a lot about this, but he said that the arrival of the fascists in Malaga arrived, and he said that he had just fled, and he said that was part of the La Desbandá, and he was in infantry and in the Battle of the Ebro. He reached Catalonia as a military man, and he crossed France on the 13th of February 1939, and from there he went to Mexico. So he spent a couple of years at war as a military man, because I know that people that left in La Desbandá, if they were young, like in this case, they got to and were part of the Republican Army, as it happened with him. The German invasion of 1940 interrupted these trips to Mexico, and there were many difficulties for women to be able to join these trips on their own. These were family trips, and sometimes I found documentation in Lajare in which women pretended to be married to somebody else to be able to go to Mexico, because they used very strict criteria against women who were traveling on their own. That was not the case of Maria, as we will see, because she reached Mexico 8 years after her husband did, in 1945. And that's something she remembers. In Mexico, there were 24,000 refugees established between the years 39 and 47. And also 1/3 of them were women. So in the Republican exile, we're going to offer some data. When it comes to women, what I've studied, we had women coming from, very different types of women. The range of age would be between 25 and 45 years, so young women. Also, some that were accompanying their relatives from 40 to 60 years old, and a quite important group of minors. Their civil state was married women. Single women were much less, and widows and separated women. And this is a significant data. There were a lot of war widows, and because these reports were androcentric, that is to say, they focused on the male representative of the family, according to patriarchal norms. So they were only the head of the family. Women were only the head of the family if they were widows or if they were separated. They usually worked at home. They were housewives. And although actually the women that are here and appear as professionals or students, those working women were very important in the case of the exile. We mustn't forget that in the case of Mexico, there were women that were very important, like the 3 courts deputies, Margarita Mende, Matilde de la Torre, intellectuals and politicians like Isabel Oyarzaba, who was from Malaga as well, Matilde Cantos, Luisa Carnés, Encarnación Fuyola, Cecilia Aguilar, etc. So many of them were exiled in Mexico, and we can see that it's a very heterogeneous exile, because they had nothing to do with the housewives of families like Paco, for example, who was only a trade worker. So they have a very heterogeneous character, but these groups, the limits start to get not so clear, because most of those exiled come from a very similar situation. Their human capital was very different, but they're the opposite. I mean, circumstances were the same, although their human capital was different. Okay, I'm going to grab a little bit of water.
Centrándonos un poco en las entrevistas, como vemos, pues hay grandes.
If we focus on the interviews, there is a big difference between Isabel de Palencia or Isabel de Oyarzaba and María Fernández, who was a housewife, who was born in Malaga in 1910. And the interview I carried out, as it usually happens, it's a live story. They start with the time when they were children. So this allows to the interviewee to, tell their story more freely, and giving more importance to whatever she felt was most traumatic. And in this case, it was her stay in jail. Well, here I have highlighted some of the things she says. She came from a humble family. She had 10 siblings. Her father had a small shoe shop, and she said that it didn't give enough money to feed the whole of the family. And she worked together with her sisters, sewing baby shoes, and she complained that there was not enough schooling at that time. And she complains in this paper, in this text. She said, I haven't been schooled and I don't want that for my daughter. So in those testimonies, there is a composition of the story. What she thought then about her education is not the same as she thought at the time when it was happening. So there are many women that have been discriminated, and that still happens currently. That is the truth of these oral stories, not only what they tell you about the past, but the reflection they make about their own experience. I'm not going to read it because you can have a look at it on the screen. So she says that she's been educated somehow as a housewife, and for that reason she couldn't prosper. And that caught my attention because it said that following the steps of this traditional model, he was Paco's girlfriend, and after 8 years of being in a relationship, they got married. And the whole of the story and the birth of their children, etc., was very important. Anything that refers to private life, it's important. It's more important than political matters. And I think that is very interesting because it is a case that is very peculiar. She knew nothing about the political activities of his husband. His husband said, well, this is my own thing. Politics is my own thing. But she suffered from that, and terribly, actually, when she was in jail. So here you can see what Mirta was saying this morning, the gender repression, how women are given this punishment, not because of what they have done, because, you know, she was a very apolitical woman. She was married, she already had 2 children, and she goes to jail. And she said, I was in jail as a criminal without having done anything. She had a very strong Andalusian accent, even if she had been living in Mexico since the year 45. So it's interesting to see how the way we talked, she wasn't a political woman. And her husband mentioned the dates. He corrected the dates because she confused a little bit the year 36 with the year 31st. So all of these events were not part of her fundamental experiences. So she didn't remember if she had voted or not. And her husband said, yes, I gave you your vote, right? And you did vote, the Republican vote, right? That was very common. And also she remembers very well the events of her private life. The case of Maria, as we have seen, is not a particular experience because this repression was thrown onto women in a very clear way. In the way she talks in the interview, she reproduces the situation as if it was the scene that she lived with the police, with the civil guards. So, and her father said she hasn't done anything, and they told her, no, it's because of her husband. And I think it's interesting here to see, and those who deal with oral history, we focus on language a lot, if it's told in first person, third person. So, and she said, I'm paying here his fault that belongs to him. So she sort of highlighted it twice. So she always considered herself to be a non-political person. And this traumatic experience in jail will actually make this lack of political identity stronger. Then she says when they told her she had to go, she said that she had to breastfeed her child, and she keeps on saying, I hated the civil guard, and it actually emphasized her hatred for the Franco regime. She said the civil guard were evil, and I was so scared that I lost my period for 5 years. So the situation in jails at the beginning, in the year 37, because she was arrested, and she said that the Red Help sent a warning that her husband was in Valencia, so somebody intercepted it, and that's how they could discover that she was the wife of what they called a red one. She spent many years in Spain up to the year 45, living on the fields in Malaga, because that's she said that that's how she could hide a little bit. And she tried to go back to her husband because she was on her own with the 2 kids in Malaga, and also her husband wanted to be reunited with her. Maybe you cannot see this very well, but this is the husband writing to the Help Council, explaining what he had done in the Civil War, and that he wanted to go back to her wife and children in 1940. In 1941, she wrote, this is a letter written by her, saying that she's really looking forward to living with her husband again. We have to say that her reasons are more emotional, more than political, but there are many difficulties. There were the difficulties also because we had the World War as well. And in 1945, she went from Vigo to La Habana, and in La Habana, La Jare, thanks to the petition done by her husband, paid for the trip to Mexico so they could get together again in 1945. She said that her child, her boy, found it very hard to recognize his father, and this child wanted to go back to Malaga, actually. And with this I finish. We can say that Mexico offered them freedom, the freedom of being able to live in there, far away from the dark post-war period in Spain, and the possibility to start a new life together. And counting on the Republican institution aid, not only Jare and Sede, but also schools. Her children went to school, and also masonry that her husband belonged to, created by El Gran Oriente Español, one of the creators in Mexico. These refugees found it easy to adapt and integrate in the country thanks to a relatively common cultural background. And in the capital, there was a very wide exiled collectivity, so there were many endogamic relationships, and like, for example, exiled children married other exiled children, and they went to the Spanish Republican Center, etc. But I can say that these exiled people were not had to live in a very humble way. Maria continued to be a traditional housewife, although she was always nostalgic for not having worked on the land and her homeland where she wanted to come back. Thank you. Thank you very much. Amparo, you have the floor. These are personal images of the concentration camps, among others. She was born during the Civil War. She's a daughter of Republican military men. In February, we cannot hear you because the microphone is not on. They went to the concentration camps in July 56. She came back to Spain. She was arrested and interrogated by the political brigade. Thank you. Yes, Amparo Sánchez Monroy, she was born during the Civil War. She is a daughter of a Republican combatants, and on the 8th of February 1939, she went across the French frontier in the arms of her parents towards the concentration camps. In July 1956, she came back to Spain. She was arrested and interrogated by the social political brigade, and she was obliged to comply with the social service of women with La Falange. She brings here today her topic, A Memory in Flesh, Memoria en Carne Viva, February of 1939. La Desbandá was walking towards France, and the concentration camps on July 1956, the coming back to Spain, the interior exile. She studied with a PhD in the Constitution of the Second Republic. She's a delegate in France of the Association Guerrilleros Españoles. She's a daughter of the war and an exiled woman.
Hola. Como bien sabemos,
Well, as we well know, the official story of this country has been written for nearly 40 years from the violence of the coup d'etat by those that were part of our civil wars, the ones that won the war, and it was a civil war and much more than that. And we've had to see a lot of years passing by, black years of repression and dictatorship, until the historical version imposed by them due to terror starts to break and falls. And finally, this wall of silence, the thick wall of silence, falls, the one with which they wanted to bury the real social story of this village, which is the story of time, human lives, laughter, suffering, hope, and death.
Y de eso precisamente quiero hablar, de nuestra.
And I wanted to talk about that, our most recent social history, of an epopeic period written by anonymous men and women whose name is not part of the official story, although they are its essence itself. Women and men from Spain who have lived this history in its most tragic dimension. Some pages that have not yet been explored that talk about the exile, that talks about concentration camps, resistance, jails, torture, and death. Of a dignified village which is fighting for their freedom, very simple people, the lay people. There were no heroes, there was just the children of the village that Antonio Machado celebrated, thanks to Juan de Mairena, when he talked about their homeland. In the case of danger, the rich people will evoke and sell it. The village buys it with their blood, and they do not even name it. We're talking about this village, an abandoned one, condemned to exile, a village that was betrayed by ones and the others. Why was I lucky enough to grow in the light of that example, sharing with them the miseries of exile, the concentration camps in France, and the disgrace of another war, all of those fights, hopes, and hopelessness of these very hard years of exile. That's why I will talk about my own memories as a direct witness of facts and episodes lived next to them, from the very painful memory of those defeated who never were really defeated themselves. But before, I want to state the following, although Pepe has already mentioned it. As he said, I am María Amparo. I was born here in this place, such a punished place, on a day of April during the Civil War, when the fascist aviation, for the first time in history, bombarded the civil population, bringing death and tragedy with it. I am the daughter of anti-fascist fighters and a member of the army of the UNE and the movement for the reconquest of Spain. Later on, he was part of the FFE, the French forces of French interior forces, the Maquis, and in October in the year 44, one of the nearly 4,500 Quixotes that went to assault the Pyrenees through the Valley of Aran. A member of the Socialist Youth Party and delegate of the International Red Support Organization. This Franco victory that was reached thanks to the support of arms and Nazi fascist troops, with the complicity and the money of great capitalism, and very well served by a totally partial non-intervention that was related to some geopolitical interests that they couldn't confess. The Republicans didn't leave any other option but to be exiled or to die. The fall of Barcelona in January 39 was going to generate the most significant flight ever known. My parents, with me in their arms, joined all of them, those very sad and endless defeated lines that for days walked tragically from very faraway places in the peninsula, with children in their arms, with cases, and with no fortune at all, searching for the frontier and hoping to find in France a homeland for human rights and a homeland for fraternity. But times were not times for humanism. And the so-seeked asylum became concentration camps. For those who went through the Pyrenees, these were camps in the south of Spain, all along the Mediterranean coast, and some improvised hostels in the rest of the territory, where the French brought these herd of human beings together, the ones that crossed the frontier in the year 39, and who reached their territory, as our colleague said, with the label of being undesirable.
That was already a lot of what we could expect from our immediate future. For some, those who left from Alicante, and also for those who were assigned to a residency or some kind of institution because they were considered dangerous. The concentration camps in northern Africa were terrible. Derfra, Mogari, Al-Shefrad. We, on the 7th of February, passed the mountains with the troops after us and with the fascist aviation bombing us until we crossed the border. On the 7th, Girona had fell. Figueras on the 8th. 9th, the Franco troops arrived to Fréjus, and the French general was saying hello to Jordana, Franco's general. And on the 10th, France had closed its borders. The 500,000 refugees that, in spite of the war, the bombings, the fatigue, the dramas and suffering that they had been experiencing, when they crossed the borders into France, they found out that the concentration camps would be the burial place for their illusions. their hopes. The villages of the Pyrenees became sad memorials as the snow was their bed there. The cold and wet sands of the beaches in winter under the wind of Tramontane and the low temperatures that are brought by this wind. Argelès-sur-Mer, with women, men, children, old people, militias, wounded on the sand, under the cold and the hunger, suffering from hunger, just like sheep, prisoners facing a terrible sea, misery and pain, being kept as prisoners in inhuman conditions, hunger, cold, racism, promiscuity, sleeping on the sand covered by the wind, under the roaring of the sea, the lice, the wires, rhinitis, suffered because of the sand that blows into you. Fear and the sea as the only way out. Madness and the sea. In that camp in Argelès-sur-Mer, thousands of Spanish children started discovering the world through the most inhuman aspect of it. Suffering the hardness of French concentration camps just like the adults did, and also the weight of the suffering and humiliation that our parents were suffering. Families were separated by cruel institutions. And that broke down the remains of our families. My family, just like thousands of others, also suffered from this. We were dispersed throughout the territories. Among the thousands of shelters where refugees were kept, my mother and myself went to the Blucher camp, also La Mamé, Mine, and also we went to prison, spent some time in jail. An old jail in north of France, in unhealthy conditions that had been abandoned, where the last occupants had been the German prisoners of the First World War. 75 women and children were taken to that jail in November 1939, and in this Aubusson jail I turned 2. At the time I was too young to have any conscious memories of the inhuman conditions in which we lived. I don't truly admire Freud, but I do feel that everything I went through at the time has been engraved in my subconsciousness. The dark noises in the night, the rats walking on the bodies, sleeping on the floor, the sound of the heartbeat of my mother while he held a shoebox where she kept me to protect me from the rats. I have felt all that. In 1942, I was already 4. My first memories date from then. That's when I felt and suffered from racism and xenophobia during those very hard days of exile. In the year 1944, I saw German soldiers execute 2 men and a woman and take my father away as a prisoner. I have that memory in my brain, and in any case, conscious and unconscious memories have left a very deep print in me. I was a child growing up very far away from my birthplace as a refugee in a country where you don't understand the language. A country that was mistreating my parents. And they were told, if you're not happy, go back to Franco. And in any case, this, of course, made me become mature very quickly. I grew up among refugees. They took care of me and they helped me grow firmly and strongly in that terrible environment of concentration camps and the war. Those refugees were, without knowing it, my best teachers. Today, after everything I lived, now retired, now that my university degrees have no value anymore, I can say, completely aware of what I say, that they have been the most important and beautiful humanities. They were communists, anarchists, socialists, republicans, the Earth's League, they called themselves. We were rejected and we lived in the darkest of material miseries, but also in the brightest of intellectual environments. What a pleasure was it for me to listen to the evening discussions in the middle of a poor room. I heard their stories, I discovered ideas, I measured contradictions, and I could compare the content of what I read with what I learned from them. Listening and learning with a critical spirit, I managed to develop my own personality little by little under the influence of the Republican values that they conveyed to me. Everything that referred to Spain was a passion for me. We were not the Red Devils. The anarchy and international crime pest. Albert Camus' words during his conference supporting the Republicans, he said, Spain's war has taught us that we can be right and be defeated at the same time. These words match what Unamuno said in Salamanca when he said, you will win, but you will not convince us. Similar to the words that my father said to me, full of sadness, "Don't give up, never give up, my daughter." These words were the best and richest food to help me take positions in order to occupy the place that I deserved in society. Nothing happens by coincidence. I am here today to pay tribute to the refugees from my childhood. These warriors that are now represented by this fight of popular anti-fascist struggles. But how long will Spain take to comply with the rules of human rights, of the human rights? How long will it take until history will be registered as it was, reflecting the truth, so that those people take the place, take the position, occupy the places that correspond to them? You were the precursors, the pioneers of the fight against fascism in Europe before the Second World War. 9 years of struggle against the beast for the freedom of Europe that abandoned you. Roltandi, Ron Captain, and other men with whom you fought in order to free Paris, men that knew you well, highlighted your value and courage, showing very clearly that Europe still has a pending doubt with you. From the concentration camps where France humiliated you, suffering from famine, half naked, and without shoes, you were resisting Nazis, and 60,000 Spaniards integrated the fight in the Maquis against in the resistance. How many Spaniards were included in the forced battalions in La Ligne Maginot, in the FFI, FTP? How many people sacrificed themselves in La Poche de Dunkerque? How many people were deported to extermination camps? Does Spain know how many were there? In Mauthausen, we know through informal paths and routes that about 5,000 Spanish people died. But what about Ravensbrück, Obisch, Buchenwald, Butzen? What about those camps? Does Spain know how many people died there from Spain? The truth is that the Spanish refugees were the first group of deported people in the phantom train that left from Angoulême, where many men and young people were taken to the extermination camp of Rabobank, and then went to Ravensbrück, where they left some women, and then this phantom train continued all the way to Irun, to the Spanish border, where the civil guard was waiting, also the phalangists, and also the reformers of the sad memory. 80 years later, where are those official lists with the names, the dates, the places and all those data that will allow the state to defend its citizens according to its binding duty and also its moral duty. They have been left in oblivion. It's like a civil death, as Miguel de Cervantes would have said. It's like killing them for a second time, forgetting their names and their places. As time goes by, direct witnesses and actors disappear, and in the meantime, buried is sleeping the pain. I wanted to say that some stories or the reviewed history appears little by little, but I would like to give you this as food for thought. I would have liked to continue.
Salud.
Muchas gracias, María Amparo.
Thank you very much, María Amparo. Thank you, Pilar. Thank you, Juan Franco. Thank you, Eusebio. Thank you to all the participants. We now have a short video conference by the last of the participants in this table. Jordi Guixé, who's going to talk about the persecuted, exiled people, the repression of Franco abroad, because those who went to the exile continued being persecuted beyond the Pyrenees. He's the director of the European Observatory of Memories of the Foundation Solidarity of the University of Barcelona. He's got a PhD in the University Paris-Sorbonne, and he's been a guest professor in several universities. He's been in charge of the Democratic Memory Department in Catalonia. He's a member of the International Committee of Memory Museums. He's a researcher in Iberian migrations and has also worked in the Museum of Edna. Among his works, I would like to highlight one that is related to the topic we are discussing today. Persecuted Republic since 37 till 51. And as Paul Preston says, thanks to these kind of works, we have access to more elements that can help us understand how Franco's regime could manage to continue enjoying his victory over Spanish democracy, in spite of the defeat of his allies.
Ya después de 10 años. Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. Well, first of all, I would like to introduce myself, Jordi Guixé, historian, professor at the University of Barcelona, and I've been the director of the European Observatory of Memories. It's a transnational organization with more than 50 partners in more than 20 countries, and we develop our memory policies, local memory policies, and also at a transnational scale as well, an European scale. I am here as a historian and to synthesize in 20 minutes the concept that I wanted to present, the persecuted exile or extraterritorial repression against the exiled, most of all in the French territory. I'll briefly introduce it, and then, as I am here online, and well, I'll try to share some images with you that I think that some of you will probably know already, but also some reflections that are up to date. Well, anyway, thank you so much for the organization of this conference and the effort that I know that you are making from everywhere in the process of reflection. And after this first flight that will mean a massive exile in Andalusia and the south of Spain, and that holds the name of La Desbandá. I also wanted to congratulate you on dealing with not only exile but the memory of the victims, and for developing it with this conference, a theoretical and academic theory, but also other kinds of policies. My presentation, well, this was also the topic of my PhD, and it's been published in a couple of books. At the University of Valencia, The Persecuted Republic, and it's this obsession with Franquism, persecuting their enemies. First, I paint in red the whole of the Republican universe with no subtleties, and so this meant a very significant repressing virtue, and also that obsession of going through frontiers and creating these cooperation networks with Europe, which was full of political groups, communications and countries in which this fascism was successful, and also in this World War, this secret war of Franco that some authors have named. This is what I wanted to sum up. The chronological framework started before the end of the war, 37, and I finish in the year 51 with these anti-communist operations, with this Fourth French Republic, throwing in another sphere the Civil War, the World War, and also the Cold War, which affected very decisively the Spanish Republicans. And at that time, 1950, for example, we had the Operation Nevada, or the one in Africa with the deportation or with no control or the legal guarantees of more than 404 names, most of them Spanish. So somehow this is the chronological framework, and I wanted to start with this reflection on what the main and the first information agencies and agents were to survey the Republican rearguard and the first areas that provoked the first exiles when they occupied the whole of the North Territory, or when in the year 38 the Pyrenees line was occupied, the capital of Lleida, and the whole of that vast area. But these offices were established from the year 36. There is a very complex network organized around what they call the SIGNES, the Service of Information of the North Frontier of Spain, that was co-funded by Catalonian politicians that had been exiled, and also bankers and politicians and other personalities, ultra-monarchic personalities that considered that they needed to defeat the Republic and cooperate in this kind of espionage through SIGNE. And I'll share with you some images later on. So somehow the beginning of this extraterritorial repression, this network of services that are in touch with Burgos and Salamanca, are reunified, and they are improved. They had headquarters like the central based in Paris, also Marseille, but also Perpignan, Toulouse, and also Saint-Jean-de-Lourdes and Biarritz, where they had La Villa Nacionea and other villages that cooperated in this spy network. Somehow, this is the beginning of this persecuted exile, of the extraterritorial persecution, because the objective was to win the war, helping, of course, Franco. Later on, the diaspora of 1939 comes in the south of France, the first welcoming, and also with the government in the French territory. They initiated some cooperations. The recognition of February of the year 39, the recognition of a pact by France and England of the rebel band and the group of Salamanca that is quite lethal for the Republic itself. And somehow it brings the basis after the war for the occupation, well, before the war ends, but from these agreements of the embassy itself in Paris and in the French territory. Consulates are occupied and embassies are occupied as well with these bicolor flag, and from then more narrow cooperation established with the French police and later on with the Germans. From these episodes, these periods, I'll talk more in detail with some images, but somehow this will present the basis for this beneficial cooperation, and a non-official one that will have a permanent element in itself. As you know, the frontier was closed with France, but with this sentence that the Spanish ones have no ideology. So there's always this neighborhood that is obliged, most of all, through the Pyrenees. And this will have a negative effect on the Republican collective who will be searching in France for refuge and aid. As you know, soon the Second World War started, and this will offer some parameters with the government of Vichy and the relationships with Betang and the Spanish embassy in Madrid. And it's his admiration for Francisco Franco as the chief of the destiny of the new Spain. So these new relations, the role of Serrano Suñez and the cooperation with the Germans, it had already been established with this first spying network with the services of the military police, Signia, etc. So this network starts to consolidate. Spain has sent and sends people in the general direction of the police for we're having problems with the sound reaching the booth. I apologize for that. So that more selectively they can do this surveillance in the same surveillance service. I'm sorry, but we're having some interferences here in the booth with the sound.
Generadas por demanda de concepto de guerra, Hay tres tipos, digamos, de entregas directas y ilegales.
There are three kinds of illegal repatriations. That there were no forced repatriation from France, but they said, but now we know that there were, thanks to some police documentation and diplomatic information, that they had these groups of women and children and individual repatriations from the territory of France towards Spain.
También hay una oscilación,
And also there's a change in the chronology of the interest of Franco, of this massive repatriation of those exiled, because in jails here, after the concentration camps, jails was full of men and women. So they were not only full of them, but also, as you know, the number of the places available there. So this was the main parameter up to these actions and interaction, powerful ones that had these the highest peak in the cooperation established in August of 1940, when they handed political personalities, Amparo, Luis Combines, etc., when these are effective. So, in fact, there is a, well, thanks to the agreement between France and the Vichy government and the Mexican government, this famous Franco-Mexican agreement of August 1940, somehow we can avoid what was supposed to be a hunting of Republican leaders with a fatal destiny, being arrested and being shot finally, in the majority of cases. So thanks to this Franco-Mexican pact, these diplomatic relations that were usually quite confusing, but trying to respect certain kind of legality by the part of the French government, because Spain always used to say that no, they had to be isolated and they needed to have a certain law that would be applied after the occupied German territory. And this law that would allow, apart from the declaration of those exiled, would allow for the massive deportation towards the Nazi camps. So that's another part of this story of this extraterritorial repression that I will not dwell on, but it's also part of these negotiations and non-official commissions for negotiation, like Brisbane Commission that regulated the French-German coalition. We had José Antonio Barroso, that was a military aggregated, and with the Spanish embassy in Paris. Somehow this always has this role of mediation, and also for trying to recover Vienna and this extraterritorial repression, because they wanted to recover goods. And Antonio Barroso, this military aggregated, was the president of this goods recovery commission, and they finished arresting and punishing people in operations that were precise. For example, the Costa Azul operation in Nice, where several leaders were arrested. Among them, we had Jordi Tarradellas with peculiar declarations in its questioning, and these policemen, these Spanish policemen, together with the cooperation of, you know, the ambassador and the ex-ambassador of this Franco cupule, also the CARICAM ambassador and other consuls and personalities that somehow were there between the service, but the diplomatic, they were part of the diplomatic body, because they were finally, they were policemen, they were informants, but they also acted on this more physical repression, the recovery and assault to headquarters like La Jare of the Basque government of Generalitat. These agents took part in it, and this commission of recovery of documentation and goods. And in a way, this is the most complex part. I analyze it at France. It's a territory of hunting and capture as well. From the year 1940, these operations continue to take place, but there is an inflection when this Franco regime in the year 1943, when there is the defeat in Stalingrado, and there we can see that we start to wink our eye towards this Anglo-Saxon axis. And as you know, this is what will allow for the persistence of Franco after the Second World War. Many conferences, worked for the, they wanted to expel Franco from power, but they didn't have a direct consequence. Leguerica, one of the most pro-Nazi personalities, they were covered by the government of Franco in Madrid. Some ministers, briefly, and they ended up in a place which was very symptomatic, which was the embassy of Washington. So this reconversion and this Spanish Marshall Plan, when the Americans funded part of Barajas, some railway stations, etc., that they were interested in, strategically speaking, then somehow this allowed this the existence of these access, and this is a very powerful symbol, but it responds to the idea that after the France liberation, after 44 and 45, with the provisional governments and the Republican government, the Communist Party had a lot of weight in this French General Assembly. So with this weight of the Communist Party, that's when the repression, diplomatic actions to stop the control and the cooperation with this Franco regime for the persecution of people, then that's when these decreased. But from the year 48, the frontiers were open, and then this international declaration, this de facto declaration saying that we recognized somehow Franco, and something that wouldn't bother so much in the south of Europe, as I said before, as a territory for surveillance and participation in a new war, which is a Cold War.
So this is what I wanted to say. And all I wanted to present to you today. And here I've brought some images. Here we have, well, these repressors, these persecutors in the international Nazism. You know that Franco also helped many collaborators and Nazis hide. Here we have one of the Nazis commanders who hid in La Carolina here under 3 different names, and he was never subject to the extradition that was asked by the Belgian government. Well, of course, there are many different characters here, and here we have Leon Degrelle, who had signed a poem book because Hélène was the wife and she was condemned, and this is from 1954. And well, so that's all. I didn't really want to take much longer. There was a control system with statistics and map control, and we see the mobilization of the exiled people continue, and the political parties continue in spite of the repression, because most of people exiled may not come back to their countries of origin because the dictatorship is still there. Well, the police services, well, they tried to control the protests in Paris, and here we have pictures from the police services, the way they counted the people participating. Well, I hope I didn't take too long, but I got the impression that it was a bit too long. In any case, thank you for your attention, and thank you so much for organizing this Congress and for inviting me to participate. I hope that my presentation was not too chaotic, but it was a very quick presentation of what I've been studying on the extraterritorial repression of Franco's regime. Thank you very much and goodbye. Thank you, Jordi, although you cannot hear us. And thank you to everyone present here. Thank you to the panelists. And I hope it was of interest to you. And now, I'd just like to remind you that we are going to publish all the contributions to the Congress, so you will have the complete presentations. I would like to thank María Amparo's presence here with this gift for her to remember this Congress, also for Pilar, for Eusebio, and also for Juan Franco. Thank you. And sorry for the delay.